This episode is going to explore and then analyse the life of Britain's most famous highwayman, Dick Turpin. So, Turpin's real name was in fact Richard Turpin. He went by Dick for short. He lived between 1705 and 1739, and as we shall see, Dick Turpin was not the dashing and sophisticated rogue of popular fiction. He was born in East Ham, Essex, east of London, and as a young boy he was given a fairly good education. His tutor, Mr. Smith, taught him to read and write. He also completed an apprenticeship as a butcher in Whitechapel, London, before returning home where he got married and began his own business in the trade. However, not all was well in the butcher trade. There had once been an exclusive butchers' guild stretching back as far as 1375. In Turpin's time, however, due to an emerging free market, the trade was completely unregulated. In other words, anyone who could get hold of meat could set up shop and sell it. As a result, the meat trade became a saturated market, which drove prices down. Many butchers ended up having to supplement their income through nefarious means in order to make ends meet, no pun intended. For Turpin, he resorted to stealing local livestock. He would cut them up and sell them in his shop as his own. One night, however, he was seen by two servants stealing 2 oxen from their master's stock. Of course, they reported this to the owner, a Mr. Giles of Plaistow, who in turn reported it to the local Justice of the Peace. A warrant was then issued and some law enforcers were sent to Turpin's house to arrest him. However, Turpin escaped through one of the back windows after spotting them as they approached his home. Dick Turpin must have understood that his reputation was now in ruin. He was an outlaw, so he began a career as a full-time criminal. He began as a smuggler for a short time. However, he soon fell in with a gang known as the Gregory Gang, named after its lead member. The gang is also sometimes referred to as the Essex Gang, because they operated in the county of Essex. The members of the gang included Samuel Gregory, Dick Turpin, John Fielder, Joseph Rose, Humphrey Walker, William Busb, and John Wheeler. It's worth noting that the names of the gang members differ from source to source. However, these names are the ones listed in a pamphlet written by Richard Bayes called The Genuine History of the Life of Richard Turpin, the Noted Highwayman, published in 1739, the year of Turpin's death. This source provides the majority of what we know about Dick Turpin and is the primary source for this episode. The Gregory Gang were a known gang of deer stealers who operated in and around the Essex forest. Common lands had previously been available to poorer classes to farm and use. However, during Turpin's time, the wealthy had begun to purchase these lands and close them off to the public. This, as well as existing game laws, had caused much resentment among many who had once depended on these lands. As a result, poaching became rife and gangs of deer stealers roamed the countryside. The problem became so common that in 1723 the Black Act was passed into law, which allowed the death penalty as punishment for the crime. Therefore, Dick Turpin and his gang were playing a dangerous game. However, by the time Turpin joined, the gang had diversified in their illegal activities. They became a gang of armed robbers, not on the highways, but in the homes of their victims. The properties they chose to target were in the countryside and isolated. As these homes were so remote, the gang could hold the residents there at gunpoint without interruption. They would then use intimidation, violence and torture to find out where the money and valuables were hidden within the property. As well as the threat of firearms, the gang was also reported to beat their victims, force them to sit on fire, threaten them with knives, pour boiling water on them, and during one robbery, one poor maid was even raped by a gang member. Rinsing people of their savings, the gang often got away with a small fortune. I'd say it's a good bet that they were also big spenders because they continued to commit these robberies. However, the violence they committed made the gang notorious, and as a result, the reward for their capture rose to £100, which was a lot of money in those days. A man referred to as Mr. Thompson was described as one of the king's keepers. He made an assertive attempt with his men to track down the gang and arrest them, no doubt probably motivated by the reward money. After a tip-off, he cornered most of the gang in an alleyway alehouse in Westminster, London. Rose and Fielder were captured and hung. Wheeler was spared the noose for giving evidence against the rest of the gang. As for Turpin, he escaped out of a window and rode away again. Other sources suggest that Gregory, the lead gang member, was also caught and hung not long after. With the Gregory Gang now at an end, Turpin took to armed robbery on the roads and became the notorious highwayman of history. On one such robbery, he came across a well-dressed gentleman, and with pistol in hand, Dick attempted to rob the man. The man, however, simply laughed, for he was Tom King, another notorious highwayman of the time. After a short introduction, Turpin and King made what was described as assurances of fidelity to one another. Turpin had a new partner in crime. They lived in a cave located in Epping Forest. It was a handy hideaway. From there, they terrorised the area as they preyed on travellers on the nearby roads. The two men were already notorious, and it wasn't long before their new spike in criminal activity attracted those wanting to claim the reward money for their capture. One man, a Mr. Bays, managed to track them down to the Red Lion Street in London, and there a shootout occurred. An account tells us that during the firefight, Turpin attempted to shoot Mr. Bays, but missed and shot his friend Tom King instead. King received 2 bullet wounds and died of his wounds a week later. Turpin, on the other hand, rode away, escaping the law once more. Turpin returned to the forest, and in another incident, he fatally shot the keeper of the forest. It wasn't long before his cave was discovered, and the hounds were released to track him down. Alone, and the authorities hot on his tail, Turpin was no longer safe in the forest. It was time to flee, and he moved to Yorkshire to make a fresh start. There, he went by the alias of John Palmer, passing himself off as a horse trader. However, the whole thing was just another scam. He would frequently travel to Lincolnshire, where he would steal horses, and return them to Yorkshire, where he would sell them and trade them. One day, however, in 1738, whilst returning from a shoot, he noticed his landlord's cock in the street. Turpin took aim and killed it. One of his neighbours witnessed the whole thing and protested, and in response, Turpin threatened to shoot him too. Of course, the whole incident was reported to the landlord, who in return reported it to the authorities. A warrant was issued, and this time Turpin was arrested. However, Turpin was still going by the name of John Palmer, and no one was any of the wiser. In 18th century England, a man standing in the local community was an important factor considered in criminal cases. A man's guilt was often assessed by testimony of good character provided by upstanding members of the public. Even those found guilty of capital crimes often escaped the death sentence due to references of good character by persons of good social standing. Of course, this all depended on the reputation of your character witness. Turpin, on the other hand, was new to the area, and therefore nobody really knew him. As a result, he was unable to provide any character references. Worse still, he was going by the alias of John Palmer, a made-up name with virtually no past. And let's face it, he could hardly tell them who he really was, Dick Turpin, a wanted highwayman. The inability to provide any character witnesses made the judge very suspicious, and Turpin was sent to the House of Correction at Beverley in Yorkshire. Witnesses did testify, however, that this John Palmer often travelled to Lincolnshire and returned with plenty of money and several horses. When later questioned about this, John Palmer, or shall I say Dick Turpin, claimed that he was the son of a butcher in Lincolnshire and his sister had kept his father's house. He also went on to say that he had moved to Yorkshire after he came into debt by purchasing sheep that had proven rotten. To confirm this story, an investigation was carried out in Lincolnshire, which concluded that his story could not be verified. Worse still, it was discovered that this John Palmer was accused of sheep stealing and wanted for horse theft. Unsatisfied, the judge chose to incarcerate Turpin at York Castle for a period of 4 months. At this time, prisoners had to pay for their own upkeep whilst incarcerated, and so it wasn't long before Turpin needed money. He wrote a letter to his brother-in-law, a Mr. Rivenall, who lived in Essex. Now, whether his brother-in-law didn't recognise the name on the letter, a Mr. Palmer, or whether he understood that it was written by Turpin and wanted nothing more to do with him, he refused to pay the postage and accept the letter. Out of sheer coincidence, the postmaster there happened to be Turpin's boyhood tutor, Mr. Smith. Now, whether he recognised his old student's handwriting or simply put two and two together, Mr. Smith suspected that this John Palmer was in fact the notorious Dick Turpin and sought to claim the reward money for himself. He reported his suspicions to the local justice of the peace and the game was up. On April the 7th, 1739, Turpin was hanged in York on the charge of horse theft. So, what can we make of the life of Dick Turpin? Here's my interpretation, and it is just that, so feel free to disagree. Turpin's earliest crimes do seem to be an attempt to support his business, and as we mentioned, the butcher trade was a difficult one at this time. Had the trade been more profitable, then it is entirely possible that Turpin could have remained an honest man. However, once that first arrest warrant was issued, there was no going back. Turpin moved from one criminal venture to another. Smuggling, poaching, armed robbery of people's houses, and of course highwaymen. And he also seems to have developed a knack of escaping the clutches of the law where his criminal associates could not. He was also a ruthless and violent thug, willing to torture and kill to get what he wanted. However, when it comes to the story of Turpin accidentally killing his buddy, Tom King, I have my doubts it happened that way. Although it is true that these pistols were very inaccurate, and according to the source, Turpin was on horseback, which would have made it even more so. However, Tom King was reported to have been shot twice. The pistols used at this time could only be fired once, after which would have to be primed with powder before being reloaded, which could take a minute, especially on horseback. And although it's possible he may have had a second pistol preloaded, Turpin would have only had 2 shots at best before having to make his escape. So therefore, I just don't think Turpin would have accidentally shot King twice. That makes no sense. Turpin's move to Yorkshire marked the possibility to make a fresh start under a new name. However, it wasn't long before he turned to crime once more, stealing horses in one county and trading them in another. So, where did it all go wrong for Turpin? Sending the letter to his brother-in-law, I believe, was an acceptable risk because he needed money for his upkeep whilst incarcerated. It was a stroke of bad luck that his boyhood tutor happened to work in the post office and work out that the letter was sent by Turpin. However, I believe that Turpin made 2 whopping mistakes that led to his downfall. The first was shooting his landlord's cock in front of witnesses. This was silly. Whether he had become complacent or whether he had been drinking and just wasn't thinking, this incident just wasn't worth the trouble and marked the beginning of the end of Dick Turpin. His second mistake was that he used the same name, John Palmer, both in Lincolnshire to steal horses and in Yorkshire to sell them, whilst posing as a respectable, law-abiding subject. It would have made more sense to have one alias for his illegal activities and another for his law-abiding persona, because once the authorities carried out an investigation in Lincolnshire into the assumed name of John Palmer, the conclusion was inevitably the result of the crimes he had committed there under the name of John Palmer. Another thing I find interesting about the end of Dick Turpin's life was that once the authorities found out who he really was, they never convicted him for any of the crimes he committed as Dick Turpin. He was hung for the crime that he had already been incarcerated for, horse theft. It's almost as if the authorities just couldn't be bothered to put themselves through another trial and just hung him to be done with it. Just under 100 years later, in 1834, novelist William Harrison Ainsworth published Rockwood, a work of fiction featuring Dick Turpin, the dashing and gentlemanly highwayman. Of course, other than the name, the Dick Turpin of fiction had little to do with his historical counterpart. However, the novel was a massive hit, and as a result, Dick Turpin became the most famous highwayman in British history. Thank you for watching, and if you like my content, don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe. Have a great day.